There's one other Rageaholic video I have any interest in responding to, so given I just covered him, I figured I might as well get that out of the way now. Specifically, I'm covering his video arguing that Nazis were socialists, although it's not only Nazis he believes were socialists. He also takes time in this video to briefly mention the socialism of Woodrow Wilson.
Socialists often lapse into warmongering to fund their flagging job programs. Just ask Woodrow Wilson.
Because when I think of a socialist, I think of the man whose attorney general rounded up and arrested left-wing activists because of fears of a Bolshevik conspiracy following the Russian Revolution. One which never materialized, by the way, because it didn't actually exist. Rageaholic goes on to discuss Keynes, saying the following about him.
Tellingly, Maynard Keynes, father of Keynesian economics and philosophical force behind most contemporary regulated economies, praised Hitler's policies in the preface to the German edition of his book, The General Theory.
However, what Keynes thought of Nazi Germany has absolutely nothing to do with if it was or was not socialist, because Keynes wasn't a socialist. Here's what he had to say about socialism, for those who are unaware. Marxian socialism must always remain a portent to the historians of opinion. How a doctrine so illogical and so dull can have exercised so powerful and enduring an influence over the minds of men and through them the events of history. He went on to write, "How can I accept a doctrine which sets up as its Bible, above and beyond criticism, an obsolete economics textbook which I know to be not only scientifically erroneous, but without interest or application for the modern world?" Despite this, the Rageaholic classifies him as the father of modern socialist economics. Not somebody like Karl Marx or Vladimir Lenin, from whom the terms Marxism and Leninism derive from. Instead, it's somebody who, as already established, didn't think highly of socialism in the first place.
Socialism is not only married to Nazism, it thrives under it. But only, of course, if you consider the father of modern socialist economics to be in any way an authority on the fucking subject.
Oh, regarding that quote Rageaholic puts on screen, Keynes never actually said that. The quote in question is a corruption of a different alleged quote from Keynes, and I say alleged because once again, there's no evidence he actually said this, which first appeared in a book about 5 years after he had died. And who can forget Comrade FDR?
In many ways, Sweden's economy today is less regulated than even we are, still stewing in socialistic New Deal dog shit as we have been since World War II. Thanks, FDR, who praised fascism as a wonder of civic planning, by the by.
So I sat down and read this article, and what I find amusing is it primarily talks about how Sanders' labeling of himself as a socialist is actually something the very people he consistently references as his ideological forefathers would reject. With his use of the word having more to do with what those who opposed said forefathers would have thought of these notions as opposed to how they themselves would have labeled their economic ideas. To quote a few paragraphs from the article, "Now we finally know what Bernie Sanders means by democratic socialism. Speaking on his political philosophy at Georgetown yesterday, the Vermont senator and Democratic presidential candidate opened with a long invocation of Franklin Roosevelt and the social protections that the New Deal created: minimum wage, retirement benefits, banking regulation, the 40-hour work week. Roosevelt's opponents attacked all these good things as socialism," Sanders reminded his listeners. Curiously, Sanders seems to agree with them, taking his definition of socialism from its 1930s opponents, the people Roosevelt called economic royalists. "Let me define for you, simply and straightforwardly, what democratic socialism means to me," Sanders said. It builds on what Franklin Delano Roosevelt said when he fought for guaranteed economic rights for all Americans. But, of course, both Roosevelt and Eisenhower distinguished themselves vigorously from socialism, which they understood to be a revolutionary program of extreme equality committed to centralized control of the economy and a cat's paw of Soviet power. Accusations of socialism trailed liberals for decades after Roosevelt parried with his opponents, from Ronald Reagan's attack on Medicare to Republicans' refrain against Obamacare. Democrats, like Roosevelt, have furiously defended themselves against the charges, but now a candidate whose ideal American economy does in fact look a lot like Eisenhower's, strong unions, secure employment, affordable college, is waving the red flag and finding favor with a large number of Democratic voters. Essentially, Sanders' understanding of socialism is primarily based on the reactionary definition of it that has become popular in the United States, as opposed to what the term truly means in politics. What separates Sanders from other people on the left throughout history has been his willingness to go, yeah, so what? As for this quote, first off, this is Roosevelt praising Mussolini, not praising fascism. If he were fond of fascism as a whole, you would likely expect him to say similar things about Hitler, for example. However, what we see is a constant dislike of Hitler from Roosevelt, along with a brief friendship with Mussolini, but that disappeared almost entirely by the mid. Lastly, FDR was not a socialist, and we know this because we have actual socialist writings from that time which routinely criticize him. At the time, the most famous socialist in America was probably Norman Thomas. And he did not like the New Deal. In fact, he even gave a speech in 1936 specifically responding to the idea proposed by several conservatives and also by Al Smith, who was the 1932 Democratic nomination for president, that it was socialist. Here are some excerpts. Empathetically, Mr. Roosevelt did not carry out the socialist platform, unless he carried it out on a stretcher. What is true is that when Mr. Roosevelt took office, he acted vigorously. His slogan was not the socialist cry, workers of the world, workers with hand and brain in town and country unite. His cry was workers and small stockholders unite, clean up Wall Street. That cry is at least as old as Andrew Jackson. Some of it was good reformism, but there is nothing socialist about trying to regulate or reform Wall Street. Socialism wants to abolish the system of which Wall Street is an appropriate expression. There is nothing socialist about trying to break up great holding companies. We socialists would prefer to acquire holding companies in order to socialize the utilities now subject to them. There is no socialism at all about taking over all the banks which fell in Uncle Sam's lap, putting them on their feet again, and turning them back to the bankers to see if they can bring them once more to ruin. There was no socialism at all about putting in a coordinator to see if he could make the bankrupt railroad system profitable so they would be more expensive for the government to acquire, as sooner or later the government, even a Republican Party government, under capitalism must. If Mr. Smith means the programs of public works either under PWA or WPA is socialist, again he is mistaken. We do not tolerate the standards of pay set on much WPA work, $19 a month, for instance, in some states in the South. We do insist not upon talk, but upon action to rehouse the third of Americans which lives in houses unfit for human habitation, which is possible given the present state of the mechanic arts in a nation of builders. I repeat that what Mr. Roosevelt has given us is state capitalism. That is to say, a system under which the state steps in to regulate and in many cases to own, not for the purpose of establishing production for use, but rather for the purpose of maintaining, insofar as may be possible, the profit system with its immense reward for private ownership and its grossly unfair division of the national income. But you see, I think that begs an important question. What exactly is Razorfist defining socialism as? What does it mean for Nazis to be socialists, and how would it differ from if they weren't socialists? This is important because without it, calling the Nazis socialist doesn't really mean anything. The claim of them falling under some sort of abstract ideology that you can't coherently explain is useless. It doesn't tell us anything. So what does the Rageaholic think socialism is? Well, here are some clips that might enlighten us.
The party that became the Nazis existed even before the establishment of fascism, though in a greatly altered, infinitely more communistic form, as early as 1920 or so. But the authoritarian colossus we know from the 40s and 30s became what it was in direct response to the ascent of Italian fascism under Prime Minister and eventual dictator Benito Mussolini, from whom I will now quote. State intervention in economic production arises when private initiative is lacking or insufficient, or when the political interests of the state are involved. This intervention may take the form of control, assistance, or direct management. This is from Fascism, Doctrines and Institutions, published in 1932, pages 135 to 136, in case you were fucking curious. Outright seizing the means of production is the bedrock of socialism. Marxism, even.
Okay, a couple of things. First off, this is not the quote from Fascism, Doctrines and Institutions. It's a slight rephrasing which leaves out a very specific word. The quote reads, "State intervention in economic production arises only when private initiative is lacking or insufficient, or when the political interests of the state are involved. This intervention may take the form of control, assistance, or direct management." Essentially, this is supposed to be a last resort only taken during drastic times, not something that is supposed to be implemented regularly. With that said, if you want to quote from Fascism, Doctrines and Institutions, here are some other parts of it. No individuals or groups, political parties, cultural associations, economic unions, social classes outside the state. Fascism is therefore opposed to socialism, to which unity within the state, which amalgamates classes into a single economic and ethical reality, is unknown, and which sees in history nothing but the class struggle. Such a conception of life makes fascism the resolute negation of the doctrine underlying so-called scientific and Marxian socialism, the doctrine of historical materialism, which would explain the history of mankind in terms of the class struggle and by changes in the processes and instruments of production to the exclusion of all else. However, the other problem is the goal of socialism is not to give the means of production over to the state, but to instead give it to the workers. With communism defining itself as a stateless, classless, and moneyless society, classless in this context revolving around the relationship the individual has to the means of production. What's being discussed here is just a general notion of economic regulation, because all states intervene in the economy in some way or another. After all, states need to collect taxes in order to even exist, and collecting taxes is a form of interference with the economy.
Price and wage controls, a classic weapon of socialism that we've sadly adopted ourselves in ever-increasing abandon,
and which have existed in one form or another across several nations since ancient times.
In fact, the 25-point economic plan of the Nazi Party included the following, quote, "The nationalization of all trusts, profit sharing in large industries, and an agrarian reform in accordance with our national requirements, and the enactment of a law to expropriate owners without compensation of any land needed for the common purpose, the abolition of ground rents, and the prohibition of all speculation in land." A particularly alarming one was also, quote, "We demand the immediate communalization of large stores which will be rented cheaply to small tradespeople," a law that wouldn't look a bit out of place at a Seattle City Council meeting.
Yeah, and the Nazis went on to ignore most of the points in this platform when they actually got power. Many of the more socialist policies were left on the cutting room floor primarily because they weren't actually what the Nazis wanted to do when they achieved power. They were campaign promises first and foremost. And anybody experienced in politics can tell you that those will not necessarily represent what said person making these promises will do once they get the position they are campaigning for.
In 1932, Hitler asserted his first act would be an expressly socialist job creation
First off,
program.
Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 33, not 32. I mention this because your source explicitly makes note of the fact that this was the first radio address Hitler gave as Chancellor. And checking Hitler's first radio address as Chancellor, which again is what your source is talking about, there is zero reference to socialism in it. But also, job creation programs aren't inherently socialist. If anything, they're usually Keynesian. which, as already established, is an economic ideology thought up by a man who thought socialism was utter nonsense. Now, near the end of the video, we get a better understanding of what the Rageaholic defines socialism as, and it's essentially just not capitalism.
One of the foremost illusions ever fashioned by the media and intelligentsia is of the mythic existence of the socialist economic model. This, to put it bluntly, is a flagrant fucking lie, because socialism by its very nature is not constructive, but oppositional. Marx emphasized a workers' revolt against capitalism. Engels said, quote, "The theory of all communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property." Socialism has no economic model because socialism by its very nature is nothing more than the negation of capitalism, a dark mirror image of an existing model, and therein lies its repeated fucking failure. To be defined by your opposite is to be nothing at all. Ask a LaVeyan Satanist. Or for that matter, the modern Democratic Party.
With this. First off, Marx didn't actually consider socialism to be the opposite of capitalism. He considered it to be more the logical conclusion of the Enlightenment-era philosophy that brought us things like capitalism and representative democracy. To put it another way, socialism and communism were not originally thought of as the opposite of capitalism, but instead as an expansion of the best parts of capitalism and the removal of its worst parts. And by the way, the Enlightenment-era philosophy that created capitalism, and with that Marx believed would essentially lead us to socialism and communism if we followed it to its logical conclusion, the Nazis hated that. And by the way, what do you mean by socialism doesn't have an economic model? Obviously it does if you're able to look at specific economic policies and declare them socialist. Are you really just defining these policies as socialist because you don't consider them capitalist? Well, feudalism also wasn't capitalism. Was that socialism? Mercantilism wasn't capitalism. Was that socialism?
Soviet Russia took this a step further by enshrining in its political document the seizure of all property by the state, meaning a black market was literal fucking theft from Stalin or Uncle Adolf's back pocket, which is why, in both Nazi Germany and the USSR, black market activity ended in execution.
The same is true of Singapore, though. And it has the freest market on Earth at time of recording, so it's clear there's no real connection between these policies and socialism. Anyway, final thoughts. To be blunt, I just don't think this man understands what socialism or Nazism are. Good night and good luck.